Welcome to Watchtower History. In the August 15th, 1935 Great Multitude article, he talks about this. He links it together. So I'm going to read a couple pull quotes from here.
So he's linking the fourth trumpet blast in Indianapolis, Indiana,
Mm-hmm.
to this. Okay.
Yeah. So we're going to have a discussion on the Great Multitude, on the Great Crowd in the future. That's not going to be the point of this discussion. That's another discussion for another time, but one that's going to be quite interesting. Some of the reasoning behind why Rutherford went that route. But here, let's focus on the message of hope.
It's hard.
So,
It's hard to do, and I'm saying this for people watching this. It is. It's hard to follow, because without understanding what it became, you don't understand how it got there. So you almost have to go a little bit into the future so that you go, oh, that's where that idea came from.
oh, because they keep pointing back.
Because they keep pointing back.
That was an evidence for what we're doing now. Well, now he's getting into the Great Multitude, which you had just talked about. So let's look at the reasoning he's using in this article and relating it to that message of hope. So I'll read a couple paragraphs here. In Satan's organization, or under it, more particularly speaking, the honest ones have hungered and thirsted both figuratively and literally. Satan's big tree in the midst of the earth furnishes them no shade. Those of Satan's world claim to be the sunlight of the world, and then they scorch and blister honest people. But now, since the coming of the Lord Jesus to the temple and the sounding of the fourth trumpet, that's this message of hope, and the pouring out of the fourth vial, these have caused the self-styled son of the world to suffer an eclipse. And now it is not so hot to those of the sheep class under them who have heard and read the message of God's name and his kingdom. These honest ones have turned themselves to God's organization, which is God's woman who is clothed with the sun. So here he's linking them together. This is part of his evidence, part of his direction he's going with this great multitude. If you keep following the logic, that's where you have to end up, or that's actually where it did end up. So let's look a little bit at the next quote here to see the reasoning behind it again. All who come into and remain in Jehovah's organization must be of one harmonious flock, whether in heaven or in earth. The words of Jesus apply upon his coming to the temple in 1918, right? So here he's linking the coming of the temple in 1918 with that message of hope because of the 7 years interpretation that he was bringing in from that Solomon's temple.
And that's why I find this one ironic. He kind of didn't even need to add that 7-year link in there anyway, and still said it was their message of hope. I guess in his mind he was trying to etch it in stone and make it more prominent than what it was by creating a new date for all this, because you don't need Solomon's temple into all this.
Yeah, and again, he's finding all these dates everywhere. And all these dates, of course, all reference Jehovah's organization. And by the way, he's the one taking the lead, so it's all about Rutherford. It's all about me, he's basically saying.
And again, he's tying the great crowd with other sheep.
Yeah.
When there's nothing in the Bible that says, oh, those great crowd, this is what I meant, they're other sheep. There's no link in the Bible for that. And it's very specific when you read the Bible, what it's talking about with each phrase, with each terminology.
Again, another subject for another time. So the article continues. Let Jehovah's anointed servant class, the remnant, now pause and consider for a moment what privileges Jehovah has given to them since 1918. The tribulation upon Satan's organization began in 1914, when that wicked one and his angels were cast out of heaven. Satan, realizing his time was short, then became very angry, and since has been bent upon the complete destruction of all flesh. And he would accomplish this purpose except for the intervention of Jehovah God, for the elect's sake, that they might be witnesses to the name of Jehovah. He stopped the world war. Jehovah has then removed the constraint that they had been put upon his people during the war, that they might organize for and carry on his service. To the remnant and commandment was given, and the gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness. And so he's saying here in 1914, we didn't focus on the name. That came about in 1925 at this message of hope. And that came about because Satan was cast out of heaven in 1914, and he was trying to judge our organization. And by the way, I'm the one taking the lead, and so it proves we're the chosen one.
But now it's a year later than what it was then. And God even stopped the war so that they could continue doing what they were doing.
Again, it all revolves around Rutherford, because all of this is all his ideas, and all the things that happened to him are the evidences he's the one who caused them. That's the irony there. He's the one who caused the problems that he's using as the evidence for why he's the chosen one.
I'd like to point out here, too, and we're going to have a discussion about this. If you notice the scripture 24:14, a lot of people question, and a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses say, oh, we have the most accurate Bible. We have the most accurate Bible. Yeah, I will go as far as to say it's not a bad translation, but it does interpret Greek and different phrases to suit their ideology. And if you look at what it says, the gospel of the kingdom, versus how the New World Translation turns it into this good news, there's a difference between what the gospel is and what is good news. And we'll get into that in future discussions. But I wanted to point that out while we've got an example right in front of our viewers with this.
While I think you're trying to be fair with the translation, I don't think it's that great of a translation. I think it's too skewed towards a lot of these ideas.
It is. But they did go an American Standard style, a modern English. I give them credit for that. But you have to realize, like you said, those certain words, and we'll get into other phrases when we have their Bible discussion, and different words, how they replaced to make it more fit. Stuff like, okay, it's not a gospel anymore. The gospel is what Paul was preaching in Jesus, is to what the kingdom is set up in heaven, come down on earth. The good news is more or less, in a kind of figuratively speaking, the three magi coming in and saying good news, peace on earth. They're trying to replace the gospel with the peace on earth, and the peace on earth now coming through them rather than through the gospel.
And remember, this trumpet blast was called a message of hope, which really wasn't a message of hope. It was a message of hate. And what he's doing is he's taking all these prophecies about Israel, or all these old things that happened to Israel, and said, hey, it's all about us. It's all about me. And so therefore it proves we're the chosen ones. So if we can, let's continue in this article here, because he does point out some more of these things that were happening in 1925. 1925 is chock full of evidences for Rutherford why they were the chosen ones, because of certain articles that came out, certain things that they did. And one of the articles is that New Nation article, the one that said, hey, Satan was cast out of heaven in 1914.
And while I was preparing some of the notes, a timeline for us for when we discuss this, it's funny you say about 1925. Under the subheading of 1925, I put a hell of a year. There was a lot happening during that year that they just, change. And once again, in 3031, the same thing, a big transition of things.
Okay, so remember what's going on in 1925, right? They were looking for Israel to return, and they didn't. They wanted Israel to blow a literal trumpet. They weren't in their land. It wasn't happening the way they thought. So he said, "Oh no, we're that nation. We're the new nation. We're the new spiritual nation." And so he's tying in this new nation article with this message of hate. I mean, message of hope. and the article continues here. The facts which the Lord caused to be brought to pass in the year 1925 show the fulfillment of this prophetic ceremony. In that year, the name of Jehovah began to come to the fore, and it came to be appreciated that Jehovah would now make a name for himself. And so, again, this is the year he's pointing at, that when they started focusing on the name of Jehovah, and the name of Jehovah being focused on was an evidence. Now these days, Watchtower points back and say, well, Russell used it, but he didn't bring the importance. He didn't bring the focus on it that Rutherford does. Mm-hmm. Rutherford is telling us exactly when we should look when that focus came to be. And that focus was 1925. And that proves that they were the chosen one because they started to focus on the name of Jehovah in 1925. And so therefore his prediction on 1925 did happen because there were a lot of things that happened there. Just like you said, it was a hell of a year. So mm-hmm. he's making all these self-interpretations. Instead of admitting he was wrong about 25, he's applying everything to 1925 to still try to say that he's the chosen one, instead of just admitting the failure.
And continue reading because it gets better.
We mentioned this before. And so what does he say here? Right? If you haven't seen our discussion on the man who dared disfellowship Rutherford, where we go into details on this, go back and take a look at that. We'll go into this in a lot more in depth. But this article, The New Nation, was not approved by the editors. Rutherford just went ahead and published it anyway. And so what does he say about those editors?
And I like how, let's read it, because he actually words it better. In the beginning of the first Hebrew month, and they go Hebrew because they got to make a parallel. March 1st, we published the article, The Birth of the Nation, meaning the kingdom had begun to function. Now, that kingdom is totally separate from what another discussion, all that. In an editorial committee, humanly provided for, then was supposed to control the publication of the Watchtower. Well, one, that's how it was supposed to be set up, so that they were doing what was proper and do that. And one, you weren't even following it back then anyway, because at that point, like we said earlier, he got rid of people and took 2 votes on that. And the majority, now think about this, the majority of that committee strenuously objected to the publication of the article, The Birth of a Nation. So they didn't believe it to be true.
And now it's an evidence.
Yeah. So once again, he put his idea into this, not a group or an effort on an editorial committee, but by the Lord's grace, it was published and really marked the beginning of the end of the editorial committee, indicating that the Lord himself is running his organization. Now,
do you think Rutherford's making himself the Lord here? That's a stretch. That's a joke. But really, when you look at a lot of these things that Rutherford's pointing at, he does take a lot of these scriptures where Jesus is in the prophecy and applies it to himself. An example of that is what he did with the sheep and goats one. Because there's a prophecy there about Jesus. And he says, when did you come and serve me? Well, when I was sick, when I was in prison. And Rutherford says, yeah, there were a lot of Bible students who were sick and in prison because of what happened, after the First World War, or during the First World War. But I was sick and I was in prison, so this is all got to be about me because I'm the one taking the lead. Yet, why did he go to prison? Because of what he himself had done, the seditious charges.
And I have a question for you, Jeff. If the Lord himself is running his organization, why do you need new light all the time? If it's already, would the Lord provide old light, or would the Lord give you false flags to go chase, and then, oh, I was just kidding, it's over here. So if the Lord was guiding it, I think we wouldn't be having new light every, what is it, everything major, probably every 10 years, it's a new overhaul of
Or we
something.
wouldn't be having these discussions
Yeah, we
either.
wouldn't be having these discussions. So if the Lord would, yeah, better if the Lord was directing, we couldn't be having this discussion because it would be so etched in stone.
But I
So
think Rutherford gives the key. He says it was humanly provided
yeah,
for.
yeah.
Were some of these ideas humanly provided for?
So
That's how I'm
yeah.
seeing it by looking at this in the history and the reasons why. Again, back to the question of sometimes why is more important than anything else.
And then he ties it back to the convention in 25
Yeah.
with the
And
message of
that
hope.
message of hope, which wasn't a message of hope, it was a message of hate. So there's a big shift here in 1925. They start focusing on the name Jehovah. They start um, bringing a more judgmental and vindictive message to the public. It's all about us. Everything starts to apply to them after 1914, 1918. There's a big shift going on here. And this pretty much becomes the focus, the drive for everything going forward from here. 1925 wasn't the only date Rutherford was looking at. Oddly enough, he says the year 1937 appears to be a marked year of importance to the people of God, including both the remnant and their companions, the people of goodwill. This is his great crowd that he's introduced just previous to that. As if this year may be introductory to something more important. In that 20th year, 1937, there assembled the most constructive and important conventions of Jehovah's Witnesses yet assembled, to wit, in the city of Paris, France in August and at Columbus, Ohio in September 1937. So more conventions. By means of radio, the witnesses in other parts of the earth, to wit,
Okay,
Europe.
not to interrupt you, Jeff. But was that the year after these important messages that they got kicked off the radio? It was
Yeah.
shortly after that.
Yes. Yep.
Okay, and this is important, people.
Mm.
Why I'm bringing that up and interrupting Jeff on this, because we're going to get to this in the future. What that message was that got him kicked off the radio.
Yeah, we're
If
going to
it
look
was
at
a
the
message of,
congressional record. We'll
yeah,
look at the
we're going
congressional
to go
record.
through all that.
We'll play some of the radio recordings. The congressional record actually mentions the specific radio programs by name, and we have those. So it's going to be a very interesting
So
discussion.
as you were saying, go right back onto it, not to interrupt you.
All right. So the public address pointing to God's way of safety was delivered to a visible audience of 30,000 and at the same time over many radio stations. Then on September 26th, 125 radio stations broadcast the public address worshiping God, wherein was condemned the conduct of the commercial radio stations and operators for improper use of this God-given facility. On October 31st, after judgment against the commercial radio owners, operators, and controllers of radio stations was expressed by discontinuing of commercially paid radio programs which relate to God's kingdom. So he's saying, because we were kicked off the radio, that's evidence we're the chosen ones. That's why 1937 is an important year, because of the message we're delivering. He's making a more judgmental message in 1937. We'll get into that in the future. Another discussion for another time. And the last quote here, it is of some significance that in the close of this very 20th year, the question of Jehovah's temple and royal house and who is in it and their duty and responsibility is considered and now prepared to be published by the Watchtower, and the publication of which will immediately precede what is here written.
Now
Right?
I'm going to
Yeah,
interrupt you on that.
go ahead. Go ahead.
The Bible clearly says who is in the temple and all that. You have to realize if the Bible says who is in the temple and Rutherford says, oh, now the Watchtower is telling you who's in the temple. And it
Mhm.
reminds me of a quote I remember hearing some Jehovah's Witnesses say, even if you didn't have the Bible, you'd have everything you need to know to understand God's plan and to move forward and survive Armageddon. Well, if you had the Bible, you'd realize there wasn't the Armageddon they're talking about. So the whole point is, well, but if you really look at that, I mean, think about that statement. That's pretty bold.
Yeah.
The question of Jehovah's Temple and Royal House and who is in it, and their duty is considered now prepared to be published by us, the Watchtower, me. I'm the editor. I kicked them off. So we're back to that again.
And so what is he publishing? He's publishing his book, Salvation, in 1938, which had a long chapter in it on the great multitude. And so he's basically saying, all y'all are not in the temple, just us, the anointed, just us who are taking the lead. And so he's now making a separation.
Now the Holy Spirit is over here. And now you don't have Christ, you have me to direct you.
We're the mediators, is right?
Another discussion.
That's where they're going. Yeah, another discussion for another time.
Discussion.
A couple more quotes here. Some other interesting facts are these. Solomon began building the temple 480 years after the Exodus. Hence, the 20-year building program of Solomon ended 500 years after the Exodus. So 500 years before 1938, or to wit, 1438, there were movements for the release of the people from religious bondage under papacy in the 31st session of the Council of Basel. So now he's saying 1938 is a very important date, and the 500 years here from Solomon proves it. And what message are we giving in 1938? It's this message of the great crowd. It's another judgmental message, this message of safety. How can you get into safety? You've got to come into safety into God's organization in order to be saved.
Interesting. And it's even more interesting how the papacy, the actual part, the Council of Basel, is the one that's even in that. If you think about that one, this one is new to me. When we were looking at it and reviewing our notes and whatnot, I don't remember them going back to 1438 ever. So this was a new one when we went over this stuff.
Who knew this 1938 was an important date as well? And the last quote here, it says, the scriptures show that after the 20 years of Solomon's building program, as above set out, he engaged in a nationwide building program. Then came the Queen of Sheba from the uttermost parts of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. This suggests the question, what is the immediate future for the people of Jehovah on earth? With full confidence, we will wait and we shall see. Right? And so this is a whole great crowd thing that he's introduced just previous to this a little bit, and now he's getting into more detail on that. And
a lot of them stood up and felt that they were part of the great crowd. Now look how excited they are now. What is the immediate future for those people?
And this 500 years,
we will wait and see.
And this 500 years and the publishing of this book that we're doing 500 years previous shows that, we're the chosen ones.
But the funny part of it is I can't help where the Pope suspended him from exercise over jurisdictions.
Yeah.
And that he should be null and void. That's the irony of that specific council.
Mm. Yeah.
And going back to that one.
Mm.
If anything, he should have hid that one. If you look at how it would really literally be interpreted and implied. But anyway.
So again, everything's revolving around mostly around this 1925 date, this message of hope, this new nation. Everything revolves around 1925 in all of these interpretations that he's bringing out in years to come. We don't hear about 1925 after Rutherford's death. They just put it aside and silently forgotten about it. But a lot of these things that were built upon it still remain in Watchtower today. So let's go back to 1925 and look at a little bit more on that subject.